Well, we are in the Torah reading of Mishpatim, and there is incredible things that are part of this text, but over and over and over, for some reason, there was this story that entered my head this Shabbos. All day I've been thinking about it. I've been trying to figure out what I might share, and I just can't get away from the story. So I'm going to tell you the story. The story is about a girl and her teacher. And the teacher started to teach the student how to read Hebrew. So little by little, learning all of the different letters, putting the letters together, starting to make some sounds. And the teacher shared this with this new student, two letters that seem by side. Now, if you know a little bit of Hebrew, you might know that there is a letter Yud, right? And the letter Yud looks like this. And sometimes when people write a Yud, and if they're just writing it and they're not necessarily seeing it in a formal print, it just looks like a couple of lines or maybe some squares. And so the teacher was explaining to this child that when you see these two little lines in your prayer book, you don't read it as the letters themselves. You're going to see it and you know that's God's name. And whenever you see these two little lines side by side, you have to pronounce it as Adonai. Adonai, of course, is the way we talk about God in Hebrew. And that's how we say God's name. Now, we don't really know how to pronounce God's name. That's why we use these two little lines, these two little yuds, and we say Adonai. So at the spot, even if the whole name isn't spelled out, we're always going to say Adonai. Then the girl continued reading with the teacher until they came to a colon that you often see in Hebrew. It's a lot like a period if you're going to read a prayer book or different parts of the Torah's text. And it also is just shown as two small dots. Only instead of being side by side, that colon is going to be, of course, one on top of the other. So the student imagined that this was also the monogram of God's name. And so she pronounced these two little dots as Adonai. And the teacher interrupted, no, Shenala, those two dots don't stand for Adonai. Only when there are two sitting nicely side by side, where the one looks at the other as an equal, only there is the name of God. When one is under the other, or the other is raised above its neighbor, there God's name can't ever be found. And I just love that. God's name can only be found when these two little dashes, lines, squares, whatever we might see, are going to be side by side. And I still see in this story a message from our text, because in the Torah portion for Mishpatim, we make a transition from learning about stories and narratives and all of these different historical events, and returning to laws, rules, expectations. How are we going to live in the world? We have a huge focus on the ger. The ger is the non-Israelite who's living with all of the Israelites and who has responsibilities and protections. A lot of times that person is going to be translated as a stranger, but it's not. The ger is somebody who isn't strange and who isn't the other, but is more vulnerable because they're not part of the tribe. And we see issues of justice among neighbors. How do they take care of each other and their other property? Who has responsibility in our community? Who is accountable in our community? All of these Jewish constitutional laws are all about relationships in the beginning of Mishpatim. There's a concern for the disadvantaged and the disenfranchised. Don't wrong the ger, for we were strangers too. Don't treat the widow or the orphan in a bad way, because we were once vulnerable. Lend to the poor, don't harden your heart. But you can't charge them interest if they're really poor. And if they can't pay you, the garment that's on that they're actually wearing, you can't take it at night because they'll be cold on a night like this. You can't even take the collateral you're entitled to because you can't put them in harm's way and suffer a cold night. After all of these laws about relationships and responsibilities, then we turn to God. But even still, it's not about praises. It's about Shabbat and our holy festivals. Festivals begin with Passover, go to Shavuot, and then Sukkot. Passover is our liberation. Shavuot is the message about receiving the Torah. And then the Sukkot is all about the journey with those little huts. So we have relationships that we have to individuals. And then there's laws about relationships that are more about a community and a people than it is about praising God. And we remember our experiences, slaves to free people, a moment of revelation in receiving the Torah, and what it's like to journey through the desert. We have, at the very end of the text, a retelling of the two tablets, maybe like those two yuds. A retelling of giving of the tablets and the presence of God being in the people. Maybe this Torah portion is like that first story. Maybe the whole Torah portion is figure out our relationship to an individual, even the ones we don't know so well. What is our relationship to our people, to a wider community? And if we have those responsibilities, how do we take care of each other? And only then do we get to realize God's presence. Just like those two little letters, a yud and a yud side by side, the same size, looking at each other equally, connected, close. That's where God is. So, in the midst of what seems to be still a very crazy world, and if we watch the news, we see all of these different images. Some of them are really quite painful. I hope that we get to encounter other human beings, realizing that they're created in God's image. And maybe we can break through those barriers, cut through it, be present for them as we hope people are present for us, and look at them face to face, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and not one higher than the other. I really do believe we can find God's presence that way. Let's move to Aleinu L'Shabeach.